Arthur Finch had always measured his days by the lake. Not the harsh glare of the sunrise slicing through his bedroom blinds, awakening him with its insistent, blinding brilliance. Not the jarring, insistent chirping of his alarm clock at precisely 6:45, and certainly not the monotonous, high-pitched drone of his neighbor's perpetually whirring, perfectly calibrated robotic lawnmower that started its circuit at an ungodly hour. But the subtle, almost imperceptible, yet ever-changing shift in the water's surface just beyond his living room window. It was his personal barometer, his emotional compass, a quiet, constant presence that grounded him. In the crisp early mornings of spring and summer, when the mist still clung to the glassy surface like a shy, ephemeral lover, hesitant to fully dissipate and reveal itself, the lake transformed into a flat, pewter mirror, reflecting the nascent blush of dawn with an almost sacred stillness. Every solitary tree on the far bank, every delicate wisp of cloud drifting overhead, was duplicated with perfect fidelity, creating a world of profound inverted beauty that often made Arthur pause, mug of coffee in hand, lost in contemplation. By noon, under the high, unwavering sun, it shimmered with 1,000 playful diamonds, each ripple an invitation to a cool, refreshing dip, a fleeting moment of respite from the oppressive summer heat. And in the evenings, as the day's heat mellowed into a comfortable, embracing warmth, a gentle balm, it bled into hues of fiery orange, profound crimson, and deep violet, mirroring a master painter's dreamscape as the sun dipped majestically below the distant, familiar tree line. This transition left behind a profound silence, a velvet quietude broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets from the tall grasses along the banks and the occasional satisfying splash of a leaping bass chasing an unseen insect that had dared to dance too close to the surface. It wasn't just a body of water. It was a living, breathing entity, a liquid calendar marking the passage of his solitary, peaceful, utterly content days. Its moods were his moods, its tranquility his own, a symbiotic relationship cultivated over decades. Lake Heron, as it was affectionately known to the dwindling number of original residents of Heron Point, those who remembered a time before pristine sidewalks and strict covenants, wasn't a natural wonder, not sculpted by millennia of glaciers or carved by ancient meandering rivers that scored the earth. It was a testament to mid-20th century suburban ambition, a man-made jewel, painstakingly dredged and sculpted from a former floodplain in the late 1970s. It was designed with deliberate precision to give the newly built community a touch of idyllic, pastoral charm, a crucial selling point for the burgeoning middle class seeking an escape from urban sprawl and a slice of manufactured paradise. For Arthur, who'd inherited his modest single-story ranch home with its slightly dated brick facade and surprisingly spacious, rambling backyard from his beloved grandparents 20 years ago, it was more than just an amenity or a nice view. It was the indisputable soul of the place, the enduring, vibrant heart of his existence within Heron Point. His earliest, warmest, most cherished memories were inextricably tied to its cool, inviting embrace, countless hours spent on its sun-dappled banks, fishing for iridescent sunfish with his patient, gentle grandpa, the sun warming their faces, clumsy, splashing attempts at skipping flat stones across its glassy surface, followed by triumphant shouts when one finally bounced a respectable number of times. and the exhilarating thrill of pushing off from the bank in a beat-up aluminum canoe his dad had painstakingly refurbished, paddling silently into its placid depths, feeling the gentle tug of the current against the paddle, the world shrinking to the gentle lapping of water against fiberglass. It was a constant in a world of variables, a steadfast friend, a repository of his family's history. He was a creature of habit, Arthur. A quiet man, some might say reclusive, even a touch curmudgeonly, with his preference for solitude and predictable routines, but profoundly observant of the world around him, absorbing details others missed. He saw the shift in light, the subtle changes in the wind, the quiet desperation in a neighbor's strained smile. His life, for the most part, revolved around his small home-based woodworking business. He crafted custom furniture with intricate inlays, delicate carvings that seemed to breathe with life, wooden boxes with hidden compartments that felt like secrets whispered in wood. He transformed raw, fragrant timber, sourced often from ethically managed forests, into something beautiful, useful, and enduring, pieces that told a story. The rhythmic hum of his sander, a comforting lullaby, the sharp, sweet scent of freshly cut sawdust that permeated his small workshop, clinging to his clothes and hair, a signature perfume, and the constant reassuring presence of the lake just beyond his back deck were his anchors, grounding him in a world that often seemed to spin too fast, too chaotically, too superficially. He'd never been one for forced neighborhood potlucks, the contrived cheer of community picnics where conversation felt like a performance, or the overly enthusiastic, almost manic wave of the HOA president, Bruce Holloway, who seemed to view community engagement not as a pleasant diversion, but as a fiercely competitive sport, one he always intended to win through sheer force of personality, relentless cheerleading, and a boundless, almost terrifying optimism. Arthur found his theatricality exhausting, his relentless bonhomie a transparent mask for a deeper desire for control. The Homeowners Association of Heron Point, in Arthur's considered, often cynical opinion, was nothing short of a blight, a parasitic entity clinging to the very skin of the community, slowly draining its genuine character. A necessary evil, perhaps, in the modern suburban landscape, to maintain property values and manage shared amenities like the forgotten, cracked tennis courts and the perpetually empty, algae-tinged community pool, but an evil nonetheless. They dictated, with an almost religious fervor and an obsessive attention to minutiae that bordered on the absurd, the precise height of hedges, never more than 4 feet, never less than 3, the permissible color palettes for front doors, only approved shades of beige, gray, or muted blue, God forbid a splash of vibrant individuality, the exact wattage of outdoor lighting, and the precise angle of porch lights. They sent out sternly worded notices about overflowing recycling bins left out an hour too early, unauthorized basketball hoops marring the aesthetic of a pristine driveway, and unapproved, subversive garden gnomes daring to defy their rigid code of conformity. Arthur, in his typical fashion, usually ignored them, filing their increasingly officious missives in a mental circular file and continuing to live his life, largely unbothered, behind his carefully cultivated privacy hedge, a verdant, impenetrable barrier against their bureaucratic intrusion and petty dictates. He was a master of passive resistance, a quiet defiance that infuriated them precisely because it offered no direct point of engagement. But then came the emails. Not the usual petty grievances or mundane announcements about tree trimming schedules or upcoming bake sales, but something far more ominous, something that even Arthur couldn't entirely dismiss, a prickle of unease finally reaching him, a chilling foreboding. The first one landed in his inbox 2 months ago, its subject line stark, bold, and demanding. Urgent community meeting, Lake Heron management plan. Arthur, in his initial unthinking reaction, had scoffed audibly, a short, bitter laugh escaping his lips, hollow in his quiet living room. What, he mused, possibly needed managing about the lake? It managed itself just fine, thank you very much, teeming with vibrant fish, providing a thriving habitat for majestic herons that stalked its shallows, bustling ducks that nested near his dock, and even the occasional elusive otter that he'd glimpsed at dusk, a flash of brown against the glimmering water. He'd deleted it without a second thought, categorizing it as yet another example of the HOA's relentless, insatiable overreach, a desperate attempt to find problems where none existed, to create work for themselves. Then came the glossy flyers, thick and substantial, heavy with the weight of officialdom, carrying the subtle, almost sickly sweet scent of fresh printer ink. They were tucked with irritating, deliberate precision into his mailbox, usually nestled between supermarket ads and pre-approved credit card offers, as if to normalize their bureaucratic intrusion. Public health and safety concerns. Regarding Lake Heron, one screamed in bold red letters, its urgent tone a deliberate assault on his peace, a calculated attempt to sow fear. This finally caught his eye and snagged his attention, a hook in his otherwise tranquil existence. Public health? He swam in that lake almost daily during the summer months, feeling the cool water envelop him like a second skin. His neighbors' children splashed and laughed in its shallow edges, their joyful cries echoing across the water, a symphony of summer, and local fishermen swore by its bounty, pulling out healthy bass and catfish that were prime for the dinner table. Safety? It was calm, contained, a tranquil haven for anyone who respected its boundaries, a safe place for leisure. He grudgingly read the meticulously bulleted points, each one a tiny barb designed to instill fear and doubt, the ever-present potential for harmful algal blooms, a natural phenomenon he knew, often self-correcting with the changing seasons, nothing to panic over. The insidious threat of sedimentation leading to dangerously reduced depth, a slow process over decades, not months, easily manageable with minor dredging if even necessary. An increasingly alarming increased flood risk during periods of heavy, prolonged rains, which had always been managed by the existing outflow system designed precisely for that purpose, and the vague yet unsettling aging infrastructure of the original dam and its crucial outflow system. A convenient, unquantified scapegoat, he suspected, for any perceived future issue. Absolute nonsense, Arthur muttered aloud, his voice tight with disdain, a vein throbbing faintly in his temple as he crumpled the slick, expensive paper into a tight, defiant ball. He knew the lake intimately, had studied it, lived with it for decades, witnessed its every nuance. He'd seen the slight green tinge of algae come and go with the natural ebb and flow of the seasons. A perfectly normal, organic cycle, a sign of a healthy, if wild, ecosystem. The depth, he knew from countless years of diving, swimming, and even measuring with his own fishing line, hadn't changed significantly in decades. Certainly not enough to warrant panic or this drastic, expensive intervention. And flood risk? Heron Point, as any longtime resident knew, was built because of its elevation above the historical flood plain, not perilously within it. The lake itself was a controlled basin designed precisely to prevent flooding, to collect runoff, not cause it. This, he concluded with a jaded, bitter sigh, was nothing more than Bruce Holloway and his self-important cronies trying desperately to justify their very existence, to flex their limited bureaucratic power, and perhaps, more cynically, to gain a shiny new project for their resumes, something impressive to put on a future ballot. The day of the highly anticipated, dread-inducing meeting arrived, marked by a bright, almost annoyingly cheerful banner unfurled, swaying gently across the entrance to the community clubhouse. Future of Lake Heron, your voice matters. A new era for Heron Point. The forced optimism was nauseating, a saccharine lie. Arthur, against his better judgment, a gnawing curiosity, finally overcoming his typical aversion to communal gatherings and forced camaraderie, decided to attend. He felt compelled, a sense of duty to bear witness. He walked in, a lone wolf among a flock of neatly dressed suburbanites, a sea of pastel polo shirts, sensible khakis, and carefully chosen, sensible shoes that seemed to embody conformity. Some wore expressions of genuine, if misguided concern, having swallowed the HOA's narrative whole, truly believing they were being saved from some unseen peril. Others possessed that unmistakable self-important glow that signaled recent election to a committee or a fervent desire to be noticed by the HOA elite, eager to climb the social ladder of Heron Point, seeing this as an opportunity for advancement. Bruce Holloway, a man whose permanent, almost unnatural, deep-tanned complexion and perfectly coiffed, rigidly silver hair made him look perpetually ready for an impromptu yachting trip or a round of golf at an exclusive members-only country club, stood confidently at the podium. His smile was dazzling, almost too bright, radiating a manufactured charisma. He was flanked by two equally polished, impeccably dressed board members. Deborah Jenkins, a local realtor known for her aggressive sales tactics and her ability to turn any conversation into a pitch, with a practiced, saccharine smile that never quite reached her shrewd, calculating eyes, which seemed to constantly assess property values and potential commissions. And Marcus Thorne, a retired civil engineer from a prominent, if somewhat obscure firm, who carried an air of self-importance like a personal, highly visible cloud, radiating an aura of unquestionable technical authority and a faint, musty scent of old blueprints and stale coffee. A distinct wave of murmurs rippled through the room, a mixture of resigned acceptance and quiet dismay. Some residents nodded slowly, seemingly convinced by the barrage of technical jargon and dire predictions, comforted by the promise of professional intervention. Others looked frankly confused, their brows furrowed in genuine bewilderment, struggling to reconcile the vibrant lake they knew with the grim picture painted by the board. A few, like Arthur, felt a cold, creeping dread begin to settle deep in their bones, a premonition of irreversible loss, a sense of betrayal. The project will commence next month without delay to ensure optimal weather conditions for the initial phase, Bruce continued, his voice regaining its booming confidence, oblivious or perhaps uncaring of the growing disquiet he had sown, steamrolling over any lingering doubts. It involves a carefully controlled, phased drainage of the lake, allowing for thorough inspection and necessary repairs of the dam, the removal of all excess sediment, and comprehensive ecological restoration efforts, including replanting native aquatic species and a gradual refilling. The estimated timeline for complete refilling and ecosystem recovery, as per our expert consultants, is projected to be approximately 2 years. A short temporary inconvenience, a small price to pay for future security for the continued desirability of Heron Point. 2 years. 2 long, desolate, unimaginable years without the lake. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, a heavy shroud draped over the entire community, particularly for those whose lives revolved around the water, for whom the lake was not just a view, but a lifestyle, a source of peace and recreation. Arthur envisioned stagnant air, the incessant jarring drone of construction equipment, the heartbreaking absence of familiar bird calls replaced by the grating sounds of machinery. His entire world was about to be stripped bare. Arthur, unable to contain himself any longer, a raw fury building within him like a pressure cooker about to explode, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly and gratingly against the polished floor, the sound echoing sharply in the sudden tense silence. 2 years? He said, his voice rougher, more guttural than he intended, echoing with incredulity and raw pain, a voice on the verge of cracking. 2 years? What about the wildlife that calls this lake home? What about the fish, the herons, the otters, the countless unseen creatures that live in its depths, whose entire existence depends on this water? What about the people who live on the lake, whose lives are intrinsically tied to it? My life is tied to it. You're destroying it. Bruce Holloway's practiced, unwavering smile, so polished in genial moments before, tightened imperceptibly, just enough to reveal the steely, unyielding resolve beneath, a hint of genuine irritation. He sighed, a sound of weary patience, as if Arthur were a particularly difficult child. "Mr. Finch," he said, his tone patronizingly calm, a condescending balm, "if I recall correctly, you're the gentleman from 14B. Arthur, isn't it? We appreciate your passion sincerely. Truly. Rest assured, all ecological concerns have been meticulously addressed with comprehensive wildlife relocation plans executed by certified professionals at great expense, might I add. Thousands of dollars invested. And the long-term benefits for the entire community, Mr. Finch, far outweigh any temporary inconvenience or perceived aesthetic loss. This, sir, is about responsible stewardship, about ensuring the continued health, safety, and indeed the future property values of Heron Point for generations to come. We are thinking strategically for everyone's benefit." "Temporary inconvenience?" Arthur scoffed, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping his lips, a sound of pure disgust that cut through the polite atmosphere. "You're not just draining a pond, Holloway. You're draining the heart out of this place. You're going to turn it into a vast, ugly, muddy pit, a barren, lifeless wasteland. And you call that stewardship?" His voice rose with each word, tinged with a desperation he rarely displayed, a raw vulnerability that few ever saw. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his posture rigid, his expressions severe and unwavering, his gaze unwavering on Arthur, a challenge in his eyes. "Sir," he interjected, his voice firm, edged with a barely concealed impatience, "the technical data is not open to interpretation. It is conclusive, peer-reviewed, and beyond reproach. We are preventing a potentially catastrophic flood event that could endanger homes and lives, a disaster lurking just beneath the surface. The current state of the lake, while perhaps aesthetically pleasing to some, presents a significant, undeniable hazard that we, as the governing body, as your elected representatives, cannot in good conscience ignore. We have a fiduciary duty to protect all residents. Arthur looked around the room, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his neighbors, seeking an ally, a spark of shared outrage, a flicker of understanding. But most people were staring at him, uncomfortable, shifting nervously in their seats, eager for the confrontation to end, for the meeting to conclude so they could return to their own comfortable, untroubled lives. A few offered quick, sympathetic glances, a flicker of shared frustration, but no one else spoke up. No one else dared to challenge the HOA's seemingly unassailable authority, their fortress of bureaucracy and expert reports. He felt a sudden, profound loneliness, a crushing isolation that settled deep in his chest. This wasn't just about a body of water. It was about control, about power, about dismissing the valid concerns and the very lives of those directly affected by a bureaucratic decision made in a brightly lit, sterile clubhouse far removed from the actual water's edge, by people who had no real connection to the lake beyond its statistical contribution to property values. They were detached, clinical, and utterly ruthless. He walked out then, the confident, irritating drone of Bruce Holloway's reassurances fading behind him like a forgotten, unpleasant nightmare. The air outside seemed heavier, thicker with unspoken grievances, the birdsong less joyous, muffled by the rising tide of his despair. He went home, not bothering to turn on any lights, needing the twilight's solace, the dimness a comfort to his reeling mind, and stood on his back deck, leaning heavily on the wooden railing, his knuckles white, aching with suppressed rage. He stared at the still, tranquil water, reflecting the soft glow of his porch light in 1,000 tiny, shimmering gleams, each one a precious memory about to be extinguished, each a diamond that would soon vanish. He pictured it empty, a vast, desolate expanse of cracked, sun-baked mud, barren and utterly lifeless, a gaping wound on the landscape. The thought twisted his gut, a sickening knot of grief, helplessness, and burgeoning, dangerous rage. The next few weeks were a blur of helpless, impotent fury that gnawed at his insides, eroding his peace, eating away at his once calm demeanor. He spent hours late into the night, hunched over his laptop, the harsh glow of the screen illuminating his strained, exhausted face. He wrote passionate, meticulously researched emails, crafting long, detailed arguments, citing obscure environmental studies, local historical records of flood plains that stretched back generations, even forgotten zoning regulations that predated the HOA itself, anything he could find to counter the HOA's seemingly ironclad claims. He called local environmental protection agencies, urban planning departments, and even tried to reach out to state park services, pleading for intervention, for someone, anyone, to listen to reason, to halt this madness. But he was met repeatedly with polite indifference, bureaucratic jargon, and the infuriating circular pronouncement that the HOA had meticulously done their paperwork, secured all the necessary permits, however flimsy or ill-conceived they seemed to Arthur. Their bureaucratic fortress was unyielding, impenetrable, reinforced by layers of legal precedent and official stamps, a wall of indifference he could not breach. He felt like a lone voice screaming into a hurricane, unheard, unheeded, slowly losing his mind in the isolation of his despair. Then, with an ominous rumble that shook the very foundations of his quiet existence, disturbing the very earth beneath his feet, the heavy machinery arrived. A fleet of massive excavators, earth-moving bulldozers, and specialized pumping equipment rumbled into Heron Point, gouging temporary tracks into the common areas, leaving ugly brown scars on the perfectly manicured grass. They set up immense, grotesque pipes that snaked like giant metallic serpents through the manicured lawns and shrubbery, their black forms stark and unnatural against the green, leading to a distant outflow pipe that emptied with a relentless, powerful gush into the main creek system far downstream, swelling its banks. The noise was constant, a grinding mechanical symphony of destruction, a relentless assault on the quiet peace he once cherished. Arthur watched from his living room window, a grim, unwilling witness to the slow, agonizing demise of his sanctuary, his haven. The initial draining was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a bathtub emptying one drop at a time, teasing him with false hope, a cruel prolonging of the inevitable. But then, as the powerful pumps kicked into higher, more relentless gear, day after day, the water level began to drop, visibly, agonizingly, inch by painful inch, revealing more and more of the lake's ugly underbelly. The familiar shoreline receded daily, exposing vast muddy banks littered with forgotten fishing lures, lost sunglasses, decaying tires, and the detritus of decades of casual recreation now laid bare for all to see. Ducks, confused and agitated, circled frantically in shrinking formations, then huddled in shrinking patches of water before finally, reluctantly taking flight, abandoning their ancestral home in search of more hospitable grounds, a poignant exodus. The fish, trapped in ever shallower, increasingly stagnant pools, became easy, helpless prey for opportunistic herons, circling predatory birds, and even neighborhood cats who stalked the muddy edges with a cruel efficiency. The familiar, comforting croaks of frogs vanished, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence, a void where life once teemed, now only the hum of machines. The air, once damp and fresh with the clean scent of water and reeds, grew heavy and cloying with the thick, pungent smell of damp earth, decaying vegetation, and exposed, rotting mud, a putrid odor that seeped into his home, clung to his clothes, and invaded his very dreams. It was the smell of death, of a dream dying. Within a single agonizing month, Lake Heron was a ghost of its former self, a grotesque mockery of its vibrant past, a vast, ugly, festering scar of cracked, sun-baked mud and shrinking, stagnant puddles, dotted with dying weeds and the skeletal remains of what was once a vibrant, thriving ecosystem. The beautiful, sparkling reflection of his home was gone, replaced by a brown, desolate wasteland that stretched out towards the horizon, a monument to bureaucratic short-sightedness and arrogant disregard for nature. His soul felt a corresponding profound emptiness, a void where joy and peace once resided, now filled with a simmering, dangerous anger that hardened into resolve. Bruce Holloway and his board members, utterly oblivious to the devastation they had wrought, or perhaps simply uncaring in their single-minded pursuit of progress, continued their rounds. They drove around in their gleaming golf carts, sometimes accompanied by prospective buyers who were given carefully curated tours, their faces beaming as if they had just pulled off a monumental feat. They beamed with self-congratulatory smiles, surveying their progress with an almost sickening cheerfulness, pointing to the muddy expanse as a triumph of foresight, a necessary evil for a greater good. They talked with a disturbing glibness about Phase 2 and ecological restoration and long-term community benefits, as if these were abstract concepts rather than a direct consequence of their destructive actions, a mere formality. They hadn't drained a lake. Arthur knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that they had committed an unforgivable act of vandalism against nature, against the very essence of the community, against his own heart. Their casual dismissal of the ecological catastrophe was a personal insult, a deep wound to his soul. Arthur watched them, day after day, his initial helplessness slowly congealing into something hard, cold, and utterly resolute. He wasn't a man of grand dramatic gestures, not given to public displays of defiance or fiery speeches. He was a craftsman, a quiet observer, but he was, fundamentally, a man of deeply held principles, principles of respect for nature, for community, for common sense, and for the delicate balance of the world. And they, the HOA, had violated those principles with impunity, destroyed his hard-won peace, and desecrated something he loved with an intensity they could never comprehend. Blinded by their spreadsheets, their perceived power, and their insatiable desire for control, he started spending more and more time in his workshop, not on client orders, which now felt trivial and meaningless in the face of such profound loss, but hunched over old, brittle topographical maps of Heron Point. These were maps his grandpa had meticulously kept, hand-drawn and annotated, showing the original waterways, the low-lying areas, the intricate natural flow of the land before the developers came along and imposed their rigid grid of perfect streets and their artificial lake. He cross-referenced them with current geological surveys he found online, detailed hydrological data that the HOA had apparently ignored or dismissed as irrelevant, data about seasonal water tables, subterranean springs, and the historical water flow patterns. He remembered his grandpa's vivid stories of the Big Wet, the local term for the seasonal, powerful spring floods that used to turn parts of the valley into temporary, sprawling marshes, almost small inland seas, before the developers dammed the creek and carved out the lake. It was a cycle the land remembered, even if the HOA, in its arrogance, did not. He looked out at the HOA's freshly laid, perfectly manicured lawns, stretching like green carpets, the pristine, untouched foundations of their expensive homes, built with seemingly impenetrable precision, gleaming under the sun. He noted the elaborate modern drainage systems they were so proud of, designed with almost aggressive efficiency to whisk every drop of surface water away from their manicured properties and conveniently into the now empty lakebed, which was supposed to handle it all, to be the community's ultimate silent drain. He saw the flaw, the arrogance in their design, the fundamental misunderstanding of the land's true nature, its historical memory. They had cleared away the natural sponges, the old wetlands, in favor of concrete and neatly trimmed grass, disrupting a delicate, ancient balance. An idea, insidious in its simplicity and compelling in its potential for profound poetic retribution, began to take root in his mind, growing like a hardy, invasive weed in fertile ground. It wasn't about malice, not entirely, though a dark satisfaction certainly simmered within him, a delicious anticipation. It was about justice, about a fundamental rebalancing of the natural order they had so arrogantly disrupted, a forceful lesson in consequence. They wanted to prevent floods by draining his lake. They wanted to manage water with their brittle rules and plastic pipes. Fine. He would give them a lesson in hydrology they wouldn't soon forget. A lesson etched into the very foundations of their homes. A lesson the land itself would help him teach. A natural consequence of their hubris. They had drained his lake. He would give them swamps. His preparations began subtly, almost imperceptibly, blended into his everyday routine, a meticulous, almost scientific endeavor. He started with the old unused rain barrels he'd stored in his shed for years, dusty and forgotten, then quietly acquired more, purchasing them in batches from different hardware stores in distant towns, never buying too many at once to avoid suspicion. He hauled them home under the cover of dusk, their plastic forms glinting ominously in the fading light, secreting them away in his backyard. He began meticulously redirecting his own downspouts no longer into the official HOA-approved storm drains that led to the now parched lake, but into newly dug, discreetly camouflaged trenches that led to the lower-lying parts of his sprawling property. These trenches, carefully sloped and hidden beneath strategically placed mulch, overgrown shrubs, and cleverly arranged decorative rocks, bordered his neighbors' land, particularly those neighbors who sat proudly on the HOA board, smug in their perceived victory, their homes perched just at the edges of the historical floodplain, precisely where the Big Wet once claimed its territory. It was a subtle, almost invisible start, a whisper of a plan, but Arthur knew it was enough. He knew the land, knew its history, knew its memory. The Big Wet was coming, the seasonal deluge, a force of nature even the HOA couldn't control or legislate away, and Arthur Finch, the quiet man from 14B, was ready. He would make them feel the water, not just as a statistic on a PowerPoint slide or a line item in a budget, but as an undeniable, inconvenient, and utterly inescapable reality, pooling persistently at their doorsteps, seeping into their manicured lawns, a watery living testament to their folly. The stage was set for a very damp reckoning.